Okay, so we come to the second part of this section on Galatians 1, 6, and 7. And we are in this verse 7, right after the relative pronoun, where he says, Houk esten alo, ime tenes eisen, ho tarasontes imas ke telontes meristrepse ton evangelion tu Christu. So let's look at, we've considered the first half of this. We've looked at everything really up to the indefinite pronoun tenes here. So we're going to look at everything from here on out to the end. And let's start by just considering this string here. He tarasontes y mas que telontes. And here what we have is two present active participles. Um, one here and one here. And they serve as the predicate nominative. Both of them serve as the predicate nominative of the to be verb, which is, right, this one right over here. There we go. Right there. And so what's happening here is a couple of things to point out. Is you have this article here. It's doing, really, in a sense, it's doing double duty, and it's applying to both participles. So he tarasantes, and also he telontes. So, which is not another gospel, except there are some, the ones troubling you, and the ones desiring or wishing. Okay, so this word means to trouble, and this word means wish or desire. And so Paul is using both here in the present tense of the participles. Again, he's utilizing what we spoke about earlier in the last video, imperfective aspect, which we said is denoting continuous action, progression, something in progress. And so, same thing, suggesting that this is an ongoing, fluid situation wherein these people, at the time of writing, are currently trying to influence new converts. So Paul is going after these false teachers by undermining their credibility. And that's why he says they're tarasantes. They are troublemakers. They're agitators. They're disturbing the peace and the harmony of God's people. Taraso, so tarasantes comes from taraso, and taraso simply, it comes from, let me just spell this word out, from taraso, and taraso just simply means to disturb mentally. And so this is how it's most frequently it shows up, to really agitate somebody. And so it's really kind of a nasty term in a sense. So this is not another gospel, except there are certain ones. Okay, and again, he uses a generality here. We're going to know later it's the Judaizers, but here he's general, and he's saying there are certain ones, and they're agitators, and they're trying to disturb God's people mentally. They're trying to pervert. We're going to talk about this in a minute. They're trying to pervert the gospel. This is serious stuff. These are wolves. These are heretics in Christ's church. And so Paul's angry. He's incensed, and we saw earlier he's marveling that they are turning away. Yeah, there's a threat from these troublemakers. Yeah, there's fault to be laid at the feet of these troublemakers. But Paul's astonished that you are the ones turning away so quickly um, from this gospel, really from the one who called you um, graciously or by grace. And so, um, here, this tarasso, to disturb mentally, the Judaizers at the time of writing were still in Galatia, and they're currently troubling the saints there. Imperfective aspect, Paul is writing to combat these troublers right now, and he's seeking to do something to bring an end to this. Um, and so, Imas here is the direct object uh, of Tarasontes. So this would be they're troubling you, and you being the direct object. Let's look at metastrepse. Let's look at this verb metastrepse. What does that come from? Well, it comes from meta stray metastrepho, and this is an aorist active infinitive. That's aorist active infinitive. And what does it mean? Well, it means to change. It means to change from one thing to another. Change from, let's call it, from X to Y. Change from one thing to another. And in this context, it carries with it the idea of changing something in the sense of, right, if you change X into Y, what are you doing? You're actually perverting it. I guess in life, it's not always the case that when you move something from X to Y, you're perverting it. But we could think of examples of like that, where you try to change the nature of something, and in so doing, you're perverting it. And so in this case, that's what he's saying, is that if you're metastrephoing, if I could say it that way, something, you're perverting it. You're trying to change it from X to Y. You're trying to take what God has said as X, and you're trying to make it a Y, and that's perversion. That's corruption. That is heresy. So it is a false. That's why it's a false gospel. That's why there is no other. It actually is no other gospel. It's a pseudo gospel. It's fake. It's built on a lie. And so there's a lot packed into that word. The purpose of the Judaizers was not. I mean, think about it. They're not merely trying to add to the message of the gospel, but they're actually, which is bad enough. I mean, adding to the message of the gospel would be bad enough. But they're trying to transform it, as I said, X into Y. They're trying to transform it into something that's diametrically opposed to what it was originally, into something opposite in nature. And so, and they do this by bringing in circumcision. They bring in works, and they're trying to nullify grace in so doing. And so this is a pretty serious infinitive. This infinitive is very, very important. Grammatically, the infinitive here, metastrepse, functions as the complement to thelontes. This is what we call a complementary infinitive. Paul uses the infinitive to complete the meaning of thelontes, wishing, because wishing is incomplete, right? Except there are some troubling you and wishing. Uh, so wishing to what? Wishing to pervert. So yeah, this is a complementary infinitive. It's complementing the idea of wishing. Um, Metastrepse. What else can we say about this? Well, I said that metastrepse comes from meta strepho. That's a sloppy looking fee. Metastrepho. Uh, it's actually, let me just erase that. Let's just make that clearer. Metastrepho. Um, and the reason why I just want to kind of pull this word out is because I want to say something about morphology here. Um, so if you just look at this fee here, okay, because something happens with this word, it's important to know this. You notice there's a morphological change. The word comes from metastrepho, but up here in the text, you don't have a fee, you have a psi. So how did we get from phi over to psi? What happened? Something happened morphologically, and you have to kind of dip back into beginning Greek again, and you remember that there are roots of words, and some of those roots end in labials, and the labials are p, beta, and phi. And so when you see those label, there's also other roots that end in what are called velars, and velars are kappa, gamma, and chi. And so what happens is roots that end in labials or velars, they will change their form. It's interesting that we're talking about uh, metastrepse being a change from X to Y, and now we're talking about a form change. So that's ironic. But they will change their form. And why does this happen? Well, if the root ends in a labial or a velar, right? So if the root ends in one of these letters, right, before the tense formative at the end of the word, if it ends in a labial or a velar, in the future or the aorist, and this it changes forms in the future or the aorist. If this happens in the future or the aorist, then the final stem consonant will join with the sigma, because the future of the aorist includes a sigma as a tense formative. And so when a p, beta, or phi bumps up against, right, a sigma, it's going to change its form. Okay, so that's what's happening here. It's changing its form to, uh, and it's going to change either to psi, or it's going to change into xi. It's going to change into one of those respectively. So that's the reason why, if you're wondering, you have a change in form when originally it was written with that and it went to a psi. Why did that happen? That's the reason morphologically. You want to remember that about labials and velars in the aorist and the future. Now, you'll notice at the end of verse 6 that we have the word heteron, and then I indicated to you that in verse 7, and I wanted to come back to this briefly, that you have allo, and allo and heteron are synonyms, but they're not exactly the same. And so it's important that so I would say that when you're looking at these two things, New Testament authors, they're they're not always preserving the distinction between these two, but in classical idiom, in classical Greek, you see a real nuance between these words, so that heteros means something like, let's say, heteros means something like, uh, I think a good way to put it would be something like another kind. Um, like almost like a different species altogether. So it's another kind. Whereas the focus of allos is another of the same kind. You see the nuance there? So heteros is another kind altogether, and allos is another of the same kind. Why does that matter? Well, this distinction matters because um, another place where this shows up is John 14:16. In John 14:16, where Jesus promises his disciples that he will send them another helper. And which word do you think he uses there? Um, yeah, he's going to use allos. He's going to use allos there. He does not use heteron because he's sending another thing of the same kind. He's sending someone similar to himself, not a different class or kind of thing like heteron would point us to. All right, so with that in mind, that nuance in mind, think about what Paul's saying here. I marvel that, haughty of content, so quickly uh, you are turning from the one who called you uh, by the grace of Christ, or by grace, into unto another gospel, a heteron. We talk about orthodoxy and heterodoxy. This is heteron, into something of a different kind, a different species. It's different. It's different altogether. It's just different. And so that's why it matters. And so in John 14:16, Jesus is promising the disciples he's going to send another helper. And so he's not going to use heteron, he's going to use allos, someone similar to himself, not a different kind of thing. And so this is a historical distinction. This is something that in classical Greek, you see this distinction between heteros and allos all the time. This is a very common thing to see in the classical period, but this nuance is beginning to fall away when we get into Hellenistic Greek. So this distinction between classical and Hellenistic, there are things that are falling out from the classical period in Hellenistic Greek where they're no longer used in that way, or Hellenistic Greek is taking on its own sense of things. And this is one of the things that begins to sort of fall away, is this nuance between heteron and allos is no longer as pronounced as it used to be. So good thing to be aware of and to know. Still, in this case, it's possible, even though this is Hellenistic Greek, kine or koine is part of Hellenistic Greek, part of that period. And it's possible that Paul intends to use this classical nuance here. We don't know. It's hard to say. But it looks like it that he does. And if so, Paul would be saying here that the heteron evangelion is something of another kind, something different in character. In other words, it is no gospel at all. And the rest of the Galatians then becomes an apologetic as to why the Judaizers were teaching, and what they were teaching was in fact no gospel at all. It was pure perversion. It was pure false. It was false gospel. And so Paul is wanting to make a point of that with the use of heteros. Um, so that is just a word. I wanted to just mention that and just say a word about that. Now, as we kind of wrap up verse 7, so which is not another, except we talked about this idiom. There are some who are troubling you, and these some that are troubling you are desiring or wishing, and then we have this infinitive, wishing to pervert, this complementary infinitive, wishing to pervert. And then let's just talk about this noun string of nouns here. Pervert the gospel of Christ. To evangelion to Christu. The gospel, right here, is the accusative direct object of metastrepse, this infinitive. So if we were diagramming this, we would diagram it as such. This would be the direct object of metastrepse, and the term evangelion refers to an announcement of good news, often in connection with a forthcoming act of deliverance. So, a good example of this is if you look in the Septuagint, you see Psalm 67, verse 12. You see it again in Psalm 95, verse 2. And then we see it in Isaiah 61, verse 1, where it's used this way. It's an announcement in connection with a soon to come, a forthcoming act of deliverance. So that is evangelion. That's the essence of it. And so what's Paul saying? That this is not another gospel. But there are some, right, who are troubling you and wishing to pervert this gospel of Christ, to fundamentally change it, to again, as we said, to change it from X to Y. It's the introduction of heresy. And so it's serious, very serious stuff. And then we have this genitive modifier, so we could even break down this noun phrase into a subset, and of which to Christu is a subset of to evangelion. And then we ask ourselves, okay, so what type of genitive is this? And to which we turn to our trusty Dan Wallace and talk about one of his 25 different uses of the genitive. and really, I want to say that those categories are helpful from the standpoint of exegesis, because we are trying to understand meaning is what we're after here. And that's why it is actually useful to think through all the different categories of genitives, because Paul is conveying something when he says to evangelion to Christu. What's he trying to convey when he says the gospel of Christ? What does it mean, of Christ? The good news about Christ? I think that would be a good way to put it. So in this case, I think this could be a genitive of content. So which would be the good news about, keyword, Christ. It's a genitive of content. I guess we could also see it, potentially as an objective genitive. Which objective genitive, that would be the person of Christ is the good news. So seeking to pervert the good news, which is Christ. So we could see it that way. I guess I lean towards content here, though. it seems to make more sense of the text. But again, that's an interpretive decision that has to be made. With an objective sense, we good news Christ. That's who we're good newsing, if you will. But we have to think through that. But the genitive to Christou is modifying to evangelion. And we ask, what type of genitive this is. We say, could it be content, the good news about Christ? Could it be apposition, the good news which is Christ, or possibly source, the good news that is sourced from Christ? The point is, whatever the syntactical function is, in using the phrase to evangelion to Christou, Paul is drawing a contrast here between the gospel that he preaches and the contrast that got the gospel he preaches and the heteron evangelion, right? This is a false gospel. But down here, the gospel of Christ, that is the true gospel. So we see a distinction here between, this is bad, right? And this is good. Very, very stark terms here in this contrast. So he says, ho uk esten alo, to which the Galatian believers are in danger of adopting. This is not another. So since this is a false gospel, it's not a real gospel, it's not, then don't do this, right? They're seeking to pervert it. So why are you turning away? Don't do that. Why are you so quickly turning away into a false gospel? Don't do that, because we have to evangelion to Christou. Okay? We have the gospel of Christ. So don't go and fall prey to this. Remember the one who called you graciously or by his grace. Remember that one. Don't forget him. Okay, so last thing I want to say is, when we're talking about these syntactical categories, let me just say one more thing about this, and then I'll show you a final diagram of the text, just to kind of put a bow around all this. So, Wallace has like 25 some uses of the genitive, and others employ, maybe a few less. But if you really stop and think about grammar, what is the genitive case? What does it do? It really only performs, 3 to 4 basic functions in Greek. And all these other categories are simply implicatures. What's an implicature? And I mean, an implicature is a pragmatic category of meaning that's derived from context. But if we're going to speak in just strict grammatical terms, I mean, the genitive really only has 3 or 4 functions, and the rest of these categories are implicatures. And so it's not wrong for Wallace to have 25 uses of the genitive. It's just that we need to understand that these are just pragmatic ways of trying to understand the text. They're not necessarily germane to the genitive itself, and it's not part of essential grammar. It's not part of the essential use of the genitive. They're pragmatic attempts by us to understand and explain the text, and that's why they're useful, and that's why they're valid and can be helpful. So let me show you then the diagram as we kind of wrap up this text and clarify kind of what we've just been looking at. So Galatians 1:6, 1:6 and 1:7. So Paul says, I marvel that, again, a hoti of content, I marvel that what? So quickly that tachios hutos, that you're turning away, and these adverbs turning away how? Tachios, quickly, and not just tachios, but hutos tachios, so quickly. Turning away from Notice the prepositional phrase is coming off the verb. You're turning away from two things. You're turning away from something and turning away into something. Pa here and ace here. You're turning away from the tu calisantos imas, from the one calling you. And how are you called? This dative is modifying the tu calisantos. You're called by grace, by the grace of Christ, if Christou is in the text. So you're turning away from that, from the one who called you by grace, and you're turning to is evangelion heteron, to a gospel, another gospel. Gospel, look at this, which, the gospel, which is not another, which is the antecedent of which is evangelion, which is not uk estin, which is not allo, from allos, which is not another what? Ho antecedent evangelion, which is not another gospel. Ame, except, right? Some certain ones are the ones troubling you, the object of terasonte, some troubling you. There are two things happening here. There are some who are, one, troubling you, and two, wishing or desiring, complementary infinitive, to pervert, direct object, the gospel genitive modifier of Christ. So that's your diagram of Galatians 1, 6, and 7. So there it is. We've looked at these two verses, and I trust that's been helpful. Love to have your comments on the channel, underneath these videos. Please comment, and let's discuss questions and other things that you have around this text and others. As we proceed, thanks for being a part of the channel. Please like and subscribe. Share this channel with others that you think would benefit from it. And until next time, thanks for joining, and we'll see you back at Galatians 1, where we'll pick it up in verse 8.